Welcome everyone to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. My name is Sharon and I will be moderating today. In pre-pandemic times, this weekly program was hosted by the Institute for the Critical Study of Society, ICSS, at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library in Oakland. During the pandemic, we have been meeting on Zoom. When the library reopens for in-person meetings, we intend to continue being online as well, what Zoom calls hybrid meetings. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to our participants from throughout the US and around the world. I'm a member of the planning committee that organizes these sessions, maintains the website, which is icssmarx.org, posts to our YouTube channel, ICSS Marxist, and keeps our financial records. For over a decade, Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library has been a platform for diverse presentations and discussion on political economy, the fight against racism and imperialism, socialism, the environment, in short, much needed alternatives to the voices of the corporate capitalist media that surround us. We always welcome your feedback and suggestions. As a group, ICSS does not represent the views of any one organization, although we are, as individuals, may express agreement with any number of different groups. Our speaker today is Roger Harris, who is an expert on the struggles of the peoples of Latin America. And I think we've met Roger before in this forum, so I'm going to just turn it right over to you, Roger. And we'll have about an hour, we'll have 2 hours of presentation and discussion, and then we'll turn off the recording and we'll have another half hour of informal discussion among the participants. Please go ahead, Roger.
Okay, well, thank you, Sharon. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming to hear this presentation. My name is Roger Harris, and I'm with a solidarity group, the Task Force on the Americas. We've been around since 1985. Let me share my screen and optimize that and
share your video too, Roger. Check the links.
Already done.
Okay.
And let's see, are you seeing?
We see your share. Do the full slideshow.
Okay, are we ready to
There
go?
we go.
Yeah, now we see it. Good.
There's lots of things happening in Latin America, a lot of it good. So let's start off and find out what's going on. Just recently, Mr. Biden had his summit on the Americas in Los Angeles. And the summit was not a success for Mr. Biden. According to Bloomberg, quote, the President Joe Biden sought to put on a show of hemispheric unity at a Los Angeles summit this week, but boycotts, bluster, and lackluster pledges instead exposed the shaky state of US influence in Latin America. So that's what we'll be talking about. And when you hear it from Bloomberg, which is one of the propaganda outlets for the Democratic Party, you're hearing it from the horse's mouth. This was a flop for the empire. In addition to the summit that Mr. Biden called, there were two counter summits, one in Los Angeles and another in Tijuana, Mexico. I attended the Tijuana, Mexico one, along with Laura Wells, who's also listening on today. The Tijuana summit, the workers' summit there, was called to be a place where people who could not attend the Los Angeles Biden summit could attend, because Mr. Biden had excluded Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. The Workers' Summit was a great success. It had a heavily anti-imperialist audience, very much labor-oriented, people that were involved in the union movement, both sides of the border. To get there, we had to cross the border at San Isidro. But the border at San Isidro, that was a new border. The border had not always been at San Isidro. we all know that. But it's worth remembering that 55% of the territory of Mexico has been stolen by the United States. And this is the historical debt that the United States has to the people of Mexico. Mexico also was the home of the first of the great 20th century revolutions. Before the Russian, Chinese, Cuban, Korean, and so forth revolutions, the Mexican Revolution took place. It started in 1910, and it guaranteed labor rights, nationalized subsoil rights. The state was secularized, and the immense power of the reactionary Roman Catholic Church was curbed. It granted inalienable land rights to indigenous communities. Since then, under neoliberal rule, those rights have been eroded, and it advanced women's rights. In fact, in the Mexican Revolution, there were women combatants. This was at a time when the rest of the so-called civilized world didn't even trust women with a vote, let alone with a gun. In fact, in Emilio Zapata's army, some of the commanders were female. This tradition lives on in Mexico. This slide here shows you a kind of a progression of red states, and by red states, I don't mean Republican states, I mean progressive states, and blue states being reactionary states. And it shows you the ebb and flow of the pink tide. We use I'm using the metaphor of pink tide to describe the ebb and flow of politics from progressive to reactionary and then back again. The pink tide first surged in 1998 with the election of Hugo Chavez as president of Venezuela, and with it, the Bolivarian Revolution. And there was a huge upswell of leftist activity and a big attempt to make regional integration a priority. It was a newfound independence and sovereignty, what we now call multipolarity, from the great hegemon to the north. The pink tide is basically a reaction to neoliberalism, what Latin American activists call neoliberalism. And neoliberalism, we should understand as the current form that capitalism takes today. But there's a paradox there, because the very failures of neoliberalism, which creates the discontent, which then the left rides that wave to taking state power. Once they're in state power, then the problems that brought them into state power are then their problems, and they have to solve them. So we do see an ebb of flow in that tide. Around 2015, a man by the name of Mauricio Macri was elected president of Argentina. He was a far rightist, and the tide started to swing toward the blue states. But now we're seeing once again the tide coming in favor of the red states. So let's pick up in July 1 of 2018. Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, affectionately known as AMLO, sweeps the Mexican presidency. This is his third time for him to run. The other two times he had run and lost, widely believed that the elections were fraudulently stolen from him. But this time, AMLO and his new party, Morena, sweeps the elections, ending 36 years of neoliberal rule in what is the second largest economy in Latin America, the 11th largest economy in the world, and the US's main trading partner. Most recently, AMLO has led a boycott to Biden's summit on the Americas. When Biden announced that he was not going to invite certain countries because they're socialist, he did not invite Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And AMLO said, look, this is not a summit of the Americas if not all countries are included. He led the boycott. Eight presidents boycotted the summit. It was a flop for Biden, as I mentioned. And not only did he lead the boycott, but he had prominently invited President Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, to an official function in Mexico, just to show his support of Maduro. And he made a state visit to Cuba. Most recently, AMLO did something kind of funny. He chose the 4th of July to launch a campaign to take down the Statue of Liberty. The point he was making was that the United States is prosecuting Julian Assange, the journalist. And if the United States is prosecuting Julian Assange, then certainly it should not have the Statue of Liberty standing because it no longer stands for liberty. Okay, so 2018, we have AMLO becoming the president of Mexico, but then there was kind of a reversal. A extreme rightist in January of 2019 sort of became the president of Venezuela, but there's a story to this one. The story is one of imperial hubris, an incredible story. So what happened was on January 22nd, 2019, US Vice President Pence called up a man named Juan Guaido, the 35-year-old US security asset. Pence asked Guaido, how would you like to become president of Venezuela? Next day, on the 23rd of January, correct, Guaido, on a street corner in Caracas, proclaimed himself president of Venezuela. At that time, 81% of the people in Venezuela had never even heard of Juan Guaido. But immediately, President Trump recognized Guaido as the rightful president of Venezuela. And then 60 of the United States' most loyal vassals followed suit, and they also recognized Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela. So this first video is of the U.S. Head of the U.S. Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Good afternoon, everyone. It was a great honor to welcome to the Capitol we consider to be the president of Venezuela. We were all thrilled that he was at the State of the Union address the other day and received such an overwhelming bipartisan welcome to the Capitol. We believe that the plight of the people of Venezuela is a challenge to the conscience of the world, and we will all stay with you, Mr. President.
So there's Nancy Pelosi talking about the bipartisan support for this puppet president. Fast forward to just this June, and Nancy Pelosi is at the Biden Summit of the Americas, and she's asked a question about Mr. Guaido.
But the person that you recognize as the leader, democratic leader in Venezuela is not here. What do you think about the absence of Juan Guaido here?
By whom?
Juan Guaido, the interim president of Venezuela that you recognize.
But I want to talk about who is here. Who is here as the president of the United States, and has been said 4 years ago the president did not attend. Who is here?
So in a short period of time, Juan Guaido goes from being recognized by over 60 countries in the world to Nancy Pelosi not even remembering who he is. And this final video I got from Twitter shows Juan Guaido meeting with some of his so-called supporters. By this time, people in Venezuela are quite upset with Guaido because Guaido has supported the U.S. Boycott, which has caused blockade rather, which has caused a lot of suffering in Venezuela. So this is the greeting that Mr. Guaido gets from his supporters. Needless to say, Mr. Guaido's popularity has plummeted. Fast forward now to October 2019, and there's a new leftist surge. The Peronist duo of Alberto Fernandez and Cristina Fernandez, the Krishna, they're not related. They sweep the presidency in Argentina, and they actually have run against Macri. So Macri is out, and now a left-leaning government is in, but they've inherited a lot of difficult problems. Particularly, there's a huge debt that Macri has incurred for Argentina, and even today, the Fernandez administration is struggling with that debt and with the blowback from it. Just a few days actually after the success of the left in Argentina, a huge setback came by on November 10th, 2019. Evo Morales, the first indigenous president of Bolivia, very popular person, gets overthrown by a US-backed coup. He has to flee. Both the military and police threaten his life. He barely gets out of Bolivia. Actually, Mexico had to bring a plane down to Bolivia, and he was even held up on the tarmac and just managed to get out of Bolivia against the coup plotters, which could have killed him. Evo has gone, and now the presidential palace is empty. And I'm not making this up. A right-wing senator by the name of Janine Áñez comes into the presidential palace with a Christian Bible in her hand. And she's going in there to exorcise the palace from the paganism of indigenous people. This is in a country that is majority indigenous. She declares herself president, and then there's a number of struggles. There's some massacres of indigenous and working people, but eventually presidential elections are called. And on October 18th, 2020, Luis Arce wins. Luis Arce was a member of the MAS, the party of Evo Morales, the party, the movement for socialism. He was Morales's financial minister, and Arce wins by a landslide, vindicating the fact that the coup against Evo Morales, which was used, the excuse for the coup was that the Organization of American States, the AOS, and their Secretary General, Luis Almagro, had said that the initial election of Morales was illegitimate. But the fact that Arce wins by a landslide proves that the MAS party was very, very popular, and that it was an excuse to do the bidding of the United States. Then in Peru, in June of last year, something even more remarkable happens. A Marxist-Leninist becomes president. Pedro Castillo was completely unknown. He was so unknown that in the initial presidential primaries, after he came in as the leader, the international press didn't even have a photograph of Mr. Castillo. The situation in Peru has been very volatile. He is the 5th president of Peru in merely 3 years. And he went, and then he goes to the first, he wins, first is the primaries, then is the runoff. The runoff is very, very close. He's running against a person by the name of Keiko Fujimori, extreme right winger. Her father is in jail, a human rights violator. And there's a long and protracted count because the vote is very close. And eventually he wins, but just by a razor's edge. He has very little support within the legislature. And from the get-go, he's been on the defensive. He initially appointed a leftist as his foreign minister. That person was forced out. And now Castillo has gone through 4 cabinets, 2 impeachments, and possibly he will be limited to just a 1-year term. In fact, this morning, in preparation for today's presentation, I actually looked on to see the news if he still was president, but he's just hanging in there by his fingernails. Nicaragua, this is in November 7th of 2021. They had national elections, and these elections very much affirmed the left. And because these elections were predicted to affirm the left, the United States took no chance. A full year before the elections were even held, the United States had already determined that the elections were fraudulent. Now we have to understand that what the United States means by fraudulent. A fraudulent election is an election where people get elected that the United States doesn't like. And in fact, what happened on November 7th, 2021, was that 65% of the electorate came out, and 76% of them voted in Daniel Ortega, re-elected Daniel Ortega by a landslide. This was a tremendous affirmation for the Nicaraguan people. In 2018, there was extreme unrest, coup attempt backed by the United States. And this was kind of a return to normalcy, a realization that they had gotten their democracy back. And it was a very proud moment for Nicaragua. I was there as an election observer. Then just a few days later, really, Venezuela has another leftist victory. The Socialist Party of President Maduro, the PSUV, sweeps the regional and legislative elections. That's in 2021. And now Venezuela, who had been absolutely plummeted with US sanctions, starting with in 2015, when Obama started the first sanctions. They were ratcheted up to a maximum pressure under Trump and continued for the most part under Biden. The Venezuelan economy initially was absolutely wrecked. I mean, more so than any other post-war economy since World War II. But through very adroit economic planning by President Maduro, with help from China, Russia, and Iran, and with some concessions to their domestic bourgeoisie, the Venezuelan economy is now on a definite uptick. The United States, in fact, has sent 2 high-level delegations to talk to Mr. Maduro. And this is, you understand that the United States still claims that Maduro is not the president, that Juan Guaido is the president, but implicitly by sending delegations to visit Mr. Maduro, it's clear that even the United States recognizes Maduro as the president, legitimate president of Venezuela. The main sticking point, of which there are many, between Venezuela and the United States has been Alex Saab. Alex Saab is a Venezuelan diplomat who is now in jail in Miami. The United States is a signatory of the Vienna Convention, which gives diplomats absolute diplomatic immunity. This is in violation of the Vienna Convention. But the problem that the United States has with Mr. Saab is that Mr. Saab was instrumental in engaging in legal international trade, but to circumvent the illegal US blockade of Venezuela. So that's an ongoing saga. Mr. Saab will be going before a Miami court on the 29th of this month, and there'll be demonstrations throughout the United States and internationally in his support. Honduras. This was a long awaited and savored victory for the left. And it came just a few days after the one in Venezuela. Xiomara Castro wins. And she wins and takes over the helm of what you might call the USS Honduras. The Honduras had this nickname, the USS Honduras, because it was like it was likened to a U.S. Aircraft carrier, because Honduras was the base that the United States used in the dirty wars of the 1980s and 1990s against the other Central American countries. And now there's a leftist in charge of Honduras. For 12 years after the coup, which had overthrown Manuel Zelaya, who was Xiomara's husband, for 12 years, Honduras had really descended into an incredible narco state. Proof that it's a narco state is that the former president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was a darling of the US government, is now in custody of the United States government and will probably spend his entire life behind bars because he is being tried for drug trafficking. Chile was another huge success for the left. This is in December 19th of last year. Gabriel Boric wins by a landslide. His opponent is this guy named Antonio Cast, Jose Antonio Cast. There was never really a bigger choice or more clear choice for voters than the difference between Boric and Cast. Boric was a student leader. He emerged out of the anti-neoliberal protests of the 2019s and 2020s. And Cast was the son of a German Nazi, an extreme right-winger. Maybe we'll get into this a little bit more in the Q&A, but Boric is not a strong leftist. He's like what I say is a social democrat, or even a libertarian. And but his election was a repudiation of the Pinochet era. And right now, he's inherited a lot of the problems that the right-wing government had created, and his approval rating is an abysmal 59%. Colombia was once called the Israel of Latin America because it acted as a US client state, projecting the military might of the United States against other countries in the region. History was made on June 6th, June 19th, 2020, when the ticket of Petro and Marquez won the Colombian election. They had come out of the, again, anti-neoliberal protest movement in Colombia in 2019 and 2020. And they had formed a pact of all the left groups, the Pacto Histórico, and they successfully ran and won. Petro is the first left-leaning president in Colombia. It's the first, not because the voters didn't like leftists in the past, but four presidential candidates on the left in the history of Colombia have been assassinated. Marquez is the first Afro-descendant Colombian to be the vice president. This is a major historical change. Petro has vowed to improve relations with Venezuela. Right now, Venezuela and Colombia do not have formal relations. And even the Monomeris chemical plant, which is a property of the Venezuelan government, but was handed over by the right-wing government in Colombia to the Guaido clique. The plant was run to the ground by mismanagement and corruption, but now it looks like Venezuela will now once again get to run the plant, which is very good because the plant creates fertilizer. And there's a huge fertilizer shortage, both in Colombia and internationally. And so there's a great need for this. So it's looking good there in terms of bilateral relations between Venezuela and Colombia. And that looks bad for the US empire because the US empire, more than anything else, wants Colombia and Venezuela to clash. Petro was actually, as a young man, he was a guerrilla. He was with a group called the M19. And he is dedicated now to fulfilling the 2016 peace agreement between the guerrillas and the government of Colombia. The negotiations for the 2016 pact between the government of Colombia and the guerrilla group, the FARC, was held in Havana, and I and some of the people from the Task Force of the Americas and the Alliance for Global Justice were in Havana in 2015 to witness these peace talks. And it's hopeful that the peace, which was honored in the breach by the former Colombian government, will now be honored by the letter by the new government. Unfortunately, this will come too late for Jesus Santrich, a much beloved man, leftist leader who was assassinated in 2021, and also for the head of the FARC delegation there, who also got assassinated more recently. Ecuador, and this is just a few days ago, really, or a few weeks ago, was in extreme turmoil. Again, the same thing, particularly now that the United States and its imperialist allies have sanctioned a third of humanity and is creating huge inflationary forces in the world economy. There is increasing lack of, prices are going up, fuel is getting more expensive, food is getting more expensive, poverty is increasing, crime is increasing. And in Ecuador, that for 18 days, the indigenous group Kanai basically paralyzed the country, demonstrating against illegal mining, against the debts that poor people have, and inflating fuel prices. They finally forced the government of Lasso to come to the negotiating table, and then the government has made some promises to ameliorate the situation. We'll see how well they stick to their promises. I would note that many of these protests were absolutely peaceful protests, which were violently put down by the government of Lasso. Huge violations were incurred in terms of human rights. However, Human Rights Watch and the Human Rights Committee of the UN were silent about that. Silent because they like to attack leftist governments, but when it comes to right governments, they actually do quite the opposite. There's a number of problems in Ecuador as there are elsewhere. We might be able to get into them in a little bit more detail in the Q&A. Brazil, wow, Brazil. If Colombia just made regional history, Brazil may well make world history. To cut a long story short, in October 2nd, there will be an election that will pit Bolsonaro, quote, the Trump of Latin America, against Lula, a leftist. And Lula is now ahead in the polls. If he wins, that will be a huge sea change for not just the hemisphere, but for the world. And speaking about more broad things beyond Latin America, the BRICS held a summit just recently, this in June. And the BRICS is a consortium of 5 countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They represent 30% of the world's GNP, 40% of the world's population. And it looks like Argentina will soon become a member of BRICS in this hemisphere, along with Iran in the old world, and perhaps other countries, Indonesia, Egypt, and Niger may also be members of BRICS. So we're getting a new economic formation outside of the US hegemony. And speaking of which, there's been a huge presence over the last few years of China in the Western Hemisphere. China has now become the region's largest creditor, and after the United States, China is the 2nd largest trading partner in Latin America. Excuse me, get a drink. China's trade has grown 26-fold between 2000 and 2020, and is expected to more than double by 2035. The role that China has played in Latin America is it's been a vital and critical lifeline for states that are attacked by the US. And it's created room for newfound independence from the hegemony. This is particularly the case during the COVID crisis, when the United States used the pandemic to weaponize disease and to make it and to attack the leftist governments in Latin America. So I would like to end this program with a little bit of commentary about the left governments in Latin America, the ones that are explicitly socialist, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. And particularly about Cuba, who had their revolution in 1959. This is a picture that I took in the 3rd largest city in Cuba. This picture was taken on one of the main streets in Santa Clara in 2017. Now, if you look at this picture, this is not a picture of what you'd call a modern looking city. In fact, a lot of the transportation is not by gasoline powered vehicles, but by horses. And Cuba has been suffering under 60 years of blockade by the United States, a blockade designed to asphyxiate the country and to make socialism fail there. This picture was taken in 2017 before the maximum pressure campaign that Mr. Trump began and Mr. Biden has continued to try to destroy the socialist government of Cuba. The US policy has had 3 legs. It's been a blockade, it's destabilization, millions of dollars each year is spent on NGOs and various other means to destabilize the government. And also the 3rd leg is the occupation of the naval base in Guantanamo. Right now, out-migration from Cuba is highest ever. It's very hard to make ends meet in Cuba. A year ago, that'll be tomorrow, July 11th. There were riots in Cuba protesting the situation, which is a dire situation. And right now there's a huge energy crisis. There's just not enough fuel to run the electric plants in Cuba. So it's a very difficult situation. Here's a quote from a report, a very recent report from Cuba that says, it is a dilemma for Cubans to make ends meet. Wages are not enough to face the very high prices that the lack of offers, real inflation, and speculation bequeath to us. And then here's some numbers. In the first quarter of 2022, Cuba's income exceeded $493 million. That sounds like a lot of money, but that's the income level. The cost level is $2 billion. That's what it costs to feed the Cuban people. They don't have that money right now. And in that context, I want to quote Amilcar Cabral. Cabral is called the Lenin of Africa, and it was a very important revolutionary. Cabral said, quote, "Never forget that men do not fight for ideas, for things that exist only in their heads of individuals. Men fight for material advantages in order to live better and in peace, to know progress and to ensure the future of their children." That's the admonition of Amilcar Cabral. And let me just end by quoting you the statement from the U.S. Peace Council. I'm on the executive committee of the U.S. Peace Council that was made a year ago in response to the July 11th riots in Cuba. And it said that these protests in Cuba over deteriorating conditions have a material basis that cannot be dismissed. No matter how heroic a people may be, socialism must provide for their material needs. The US blockade of Cuba is designed precisely to thwart that and discredit socialism in Cuba and anywhere else where oppressed people try to better their lot. And it continues, whatever the alleged problems of Cuba, it is being attacked precisely because that small island nation promises a humane alternative to the decaying neoliberal order of present-day capitalism and its pending crisis of humanity. If a critical spotlight is needed, it is not on how the Cubans with so little should have done better, but on how the imperialists with so much must be defeated. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roger. There's so much in what you talked about that needs more analysis, and I'm hoping that we're going to get some really good questions and dialogue. But before we do that, I want to call on Jean first to talk about a few events that are programs that are coming up, and then we'll ask Richard F. to say something about our finances. Jean, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm unmuted now, I guess.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, thank you so much, Roger. That was really superlative, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Next week, we have a special time and a special person, namely Vladimir Kozin, who is a Russian in Russia, speaking. He has a blog that goes out regularly, and he'll talk about, did Russia intend to take over Ukraine with its, quote, special military operation? So we are looking forward to that. Again, remind you, it is a special time, 9:45 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. And I don't know, that'll be online, I'm pretty sure. July 24th, we're still exploring various options. We have some very good options but we don't know exactly what they are. And July 31st, our old friend Grover Furr will talk about Lenin's so-called testament, which we all know is a fraud. And then going down in August, we have a forthcoming book by Robert Orvez, We the Elites, Why the US Constitution Serves the Few, which I think we all kind of feel in our bones, but now we can get it into our heads. So that's coming up, and we have a good set of things coming up. So over to Richard.
Thank you. Go ahead, Richard.
Thank you. Just to reiterate something that Jean said, we will be starting earlier next week. So check your email for the exact time. I believe it's 10 o'clock or
And 9:45 Pacific time.
9:45 Pacific time. So set your alarm clocks for that. I just want to say about our finances. We're in fairly good shape, but we still need funds to our operations. We're mostly getting regular contributions, automatic contributions from a number of people, but there's plenty of room for additional ones, and I think we can put it to good use, especially since we're starting to have hybrid meetings in the next couple of weeks. We're gonna the meetings with Grover Furr and Robert Ovets will both be based in the library, so we'll have a live audience, but those of you across the world will also be able to see it through Zoom and of course through YouTube. So that'll require some more expenditures on our part. So please contribute generously. That's all. I put the information in the chat, but it's also in your email and also on our website. So thank you for your contributions.
Thank you, Richard. So now the floor is open. If you would like to make a comment or ask Roger a question, you can click on the reactions button on the bottom of your screen and raise your hand. And then I'll try to keep the stack in the order in which people raise their hands. So we have one person right now. Raj, go ahead, please. And then Jean.
Roger, thank you for informing us, and I wouldn't know as much as
Raj, your voice is pretty faint. Can you raise your volume or get closer to the computer?
Okay, can you hear me now?
That's better, yes.
Okay, Roger, thank you. But for your activism, I wouldn't know as much about Latin America. So thank you very much for a very informative presentation. Now, I have three questions. First is, I saw the color pink or red that you had 10 countries, Latin and South America, and blue, the reactionary countries, were 5. So is that the attendance also in LA versus Cuba? I think that's where it was held. So that's first question, just clarification question. The second is...
I'm sorry, Raj, I'm not quite sure I understand that.
There were 10 countries, I counted, there were 10 countries, if you count Latin and South America combined, just south of the border, that were colored red or pink. And then only 5 countries, Brazil is very big blue, but there are only 5 countries that were. So is that the attendance in LA versus the alternative thing? That's a simple clarifying question. So the second question is that now all these are leftist governments. In other words, only 3 are even declaring themselves as socialist: Cuba for sure, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. Okay, so, and they are also the models which are not, they're varying models of socialism, let's put it, but they are committed to socialism. and Morales' party is committed on a road to socialism. So my question is, the difficulty I've seen is if you go communist or socialist, US pounds on you, it basically destroys you. And then if you go a little bit softer, you have this alternate thing, which is, okay, you make some compromises, then they get you through the compromise. So just some thoughts on, and then in the entry of China helps them a little bit. So situation is different, but I'd like you to a little bit dwell on how you see the outcome. The pink tide has always given way to reactionary tide right after, soon after a few years. So what is your prognosis and why it is so? So that's a little more analytical question. And the third question is specifically about Cuba. Why is Cuba unable to feed its people? I mean, basically, I know the sanctions are, very powerful. Cuba will be one of the richest countries, but for the sanctions. Okay, I know that. But so that's the question is why they are unable to get to a point where, I mean, they can't buy oil because they can't export anything. Just a little bit more analysis on why this $2 billion versus a $500 million income, $2 billion of need. Why can't they solve? They've solved these problems under different and associated with that, China, the country that we call socialist, could do much more like Soviet Union was doing. Why can't China step up and help Cuba? Cuba is a key country for all of us, very valuable country, a model for socialism. And if it's killed, it's a very big loss. Why can't China step up if indeed it is a socialist country? Thank you. These are the three.
Okay. Yeah, the questions get progressively more difficult. So the first one's pretty easy. The maps I got them from Wikipedia. I don't have the technical ability to generate maps, and so it was just whoever created those maps. They decided which were red states and which were blue states. In terms of the Biden summit, all but 8 countries were represented in Los Angeles, but at the presidential level.
That would be seven. That means 7.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, and then in terms of the alternative summits, none of them had official presidential level members. They had people from the boycotted countries, but not any official things. In terms of the second question was, I'm sorry, it was something about leftists.
Yeah. So the leftist governments usually have come and they get, there are 2 processes. One is if you go socialist, they'll come and destroy you militarily and through coups. And the leftists usually have difficulty because they undermine them through capitalist penetration. So what do you think this pink wave, what hope and why you have hope, if you have hope, and what is China's role in that hope? That was my second question.
Okay, so that combines the second and third question. Those are huge questions. I think there'll be actually topics of other programs for some time to come. But I think I think you and I would agree that the world is in somewhat of an inflection point right now. Things are very, very volatile. At this point, we do see both the power of the empire to destroy its enemies because of its huge economic ability to create blockades in them, but also its inability to prevent other countries from rebelling. And China is definitely part of that equation. It's very important. I think that we wouldn't be seeing the red tide we're seeing right now if it were not for China. I think particularly during, think back like during the pandemic, how desperate everybody was to get their first immunization shot. The United States used the pandemic, weaponized the pandemic and prevented vaccines from getting to the country. China brought vaccines to Venezuela. It teamed with Cuba to create vaccines, and Cuba, by the way, created 5 vaccines, I think, and 3 of them actually have gone into production and use. So remarkable for a third world country to do that, especially under such conditions. So the role of China has been vital. There would not be a pink tide today were it not there. Could China do more? Obviously, materially, it has the ability to do that, and we'll see how that shakes out.
No, but if I may persist just on Cuba,
Sure.
Is it also not mismanagement by their government, or are they totally innocent and only a victim? Because in the past they have been able to manage, and they were under tremendous pressure before. When Soviet Union fell apart, China was nowhere, they could survive. Why are they with China there? And is it, China cannot bail out every country. No country bails out anybody, and I don't think they have any reason to completely bail them out because the other side has a responsibility. Do you see something not being done right in Cuba, since you're so familiar? I just like to see that.
Yeah, many people ask that question, and that goes back to the question of, why can't they just feed themselves? I mean, why don't they just, grow some corn in the backyard? And in fact, they do have a fairly developed urban agro. I'm missing the term, but it's urban, basically urban farming. And during the special period, they did it as well. I think we'd have to go into a lot of details, but what I would say though is that the blockade is designed to asphyxiate them, and whatever we might think of the imperialists, they're not stupid, and they have almost unlimited resources. So it's very difficult to overcome the blockade. Right now, agriculture is not mechanized in Cuba. They plow the field with either human labor or animal labor. Very inefficient things. The tropics are a very difficult place to grow crops because of the high level of pests and stuff like that. The soils in Cuba are not rich. You need pesticides to deal with the pests, and you need fertilizers to improve the quality of the soil. Both of them are denied them by the blockade. Also, there's a paradox there in Cuba where they have a very, very highly educated workforce. It's a place where education is free. And if you have been trained to, let's say, be a professional, and then the incentives to work, 12 hours a day or 8 hours a day in the hot tropical sun, the incentives aren't very strong. In Cuba, my understanding is that farm laborers actually are one of the highest paid of all people, but still it's hard to get a highly educated labor force, particularly a labor force that has a social safety net that doesn't have to worry about unemployment and stuff like that, and they can get free healthcare. So there are many complications to my understanding of that. I think that maybe there'll be other people in this group right now who have visited Cuba and have also explored that question. But it remains a very difficult question of how to feed the people. And right now, they don't have enough money to do that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead, Jean.
Okay, well, thank you. And I really appreciate your talk in its entirety and further your discussion of the centrality of China in this. And I want to kind of rephrase that about talking about a red star over the pink tide, because although many people don't understand that China is indeed a socialistic society, it is playing a key role as a socialist society, and it's doing key things, as you mentioned, that the linkage between the Cuba is now a part of the Belt and Road Initiative of China, and other things going on, such as Argentina joined BRICS, which you mentioned, and you did cover a lot of that. But again, I think it's important to understand, how China operates, which is fundamentally different than was done back in the days of Che Guevara and the earlier period of communist revolutions, in that it takes a different tack. But it's still a Marxist-Leninist society. Xi Jinping knows his Marxism as well as anybody, I believe. And I see this as a very positive sign, again, going towards multipolarity away from the hegemonism, and also linking up with Putin and the Russia, which is, we all know, is the home of the October Revolution. So I kind of like to refocus that last question a little bit, if you care to elaborate, which I've done also. But again, I appreciate your further thoughts on this. Thank you.
There's 19 countries in Latin America who have now joined the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's becoming quite important, not only in Africa, Asia, but now in Latin America. So China is making major inroads in there. There were contradictions. In Ecuador today, there was a major strike at a copper mine that's owned by China. So you have a labor conflict between workers and a Chinese-owned copper mine. So I think, to me, the critical question is, in terms of the geopolitical balance of power and the class warfare between the progressive and reactionary forces, where does China stand? And I think right now in Latin America, we can sort of debate, as we have on almost every single one of these meetings, of whether it's a Marxist-Leninist or not. But I think the more critical question is what role it's playing right now. And it is playing a counter-hegemonic role, predominantly in the hemisphere right now.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. And I didn't know that about 19 countries joining the Belt and Roads. That's pretty impressive. If nobody else is there, can I just ask another little question following that up?
Go ahead, Jean, please.
Okay, because you did mention a little bit about the poor soil and fertilizer and so forth. And some time ago, we did have a talk about how, with proper mechanisms, you can rebuild the soil using various kinds of techniques, going back in part, I think, to Barry Commoner's work on, non-agriculture that does not take, require an industrial agriculture. And I don't know, and I know there was a nice video out a long time ago, called The Greening of Cuba, that talked about how Cuba was able to adjust to the withdrawal of Russian, basically oil and subsidies and so forth, and how it adjusts by backyard farms. And I noticed the horsepower in one of the photos you showed. So I just wonder if you'd like to talk about that a little bit. I'd be very interested.
I mean, I've visited some of these urban things like that, and there might be other people in the audience that might wish to speak about that. I think, though, what we really have to appreciate is that every opportunity that the imperialists have to tighten the screws, they tighten the screws. And the pandemic sort of made things so much more difficult. In Cuba, for instance, they took the position of, we're going to lock down the society so that the disease doesn't spread. Now, you could do that in some countries where you can call up DoorDash and get a meal. But in Cuba, if people don't work, there's not going to be food to be put on the table. So they were put in the imperialists gave them the choice of either dying from COVID or dying from starvation. That's how they used the pandemic. They cut off remittances, which was an example of where Cuban Americans would send money back to people in Cuba so that they could not get financial support. They needed syringes, and probably some of you actually probably in this audience sent money to send syringes to Cuba, but at every corner they were cut off. They needed ventilators. They needed the equipment. They had to buy that on the international market, but that international market was cut off. When it gets cut off, then they have to pay higher prices. So the design of those things, intention and design, is to make it impossible for socialism to succeed. Socialism is a system that is designed to meet people's needs. Capitalism is a system that creates needs that can't be fulfilled. You never can be rich enough. You never can be sexy enough under a capitalist system. But in socialism, it's designed to meet people's needs. And the United States understands that if they can prevent this country from meeting people's material needs, then they can make it a failed country. And that's their intention. For us, that means that our solidarity is needed more than ever, and that the Cubans can resist, but it's only us and the belly of the beast that can overthrow the beast.
I'd like to just call on myself very briefly, and then I'll call on Janet and Laura. My concern has to do with what you just said, Roger, about our solidarity. So I don't think we get much pushback to say in this group to say that Americans who understand everything that you presented, we need to try to get our governments, our capitalists boot off the necks of the people of Latin America. And particularly with regard to Cuba, our solidarity is really key. And what I'm wondering is, and I have the same question around immigration reform, how can we make our voices louder? How can we try to mobilize more people to demand that whatever administration is in power in the United States, stop the blockade and fight for the right to stay home, allow people of Latin America to stay home and live decent lives. It's so frustrating to know that we have answers. We know what needs to be, what US policy needs to change. And yet we're unable to, to even raise it within the Democratic Party. We don't have, our voices are not very loud society-wide. And I'm just wondering if the Peace Council has grappled with that question, and what do you think, Roger?
Yeah, it's a terribly large question, Sharon, and I don't want to presume that I know the answer, because really the heart of the question is, how do you overthrow imperialism? And that's a very big question.
Right.
I think where I would begin is to say that the Democratic Party is not on the side of the world's people,
Right.
and that there has to be a break from the Democratic Party. But I don't want to get on the soapbox
Okay.
for this one. And,
All right.
and I think others probably have thought
Yeah.
this too. I think it's worthwhile to be involved in an anti-imperialist organization that amplifies your voice. But I know that's not a really adequate answer
Right.
for a very good question.
Right. Thank you. Okay, back to the stack. So Janet, then followed by Laura, followed by Sharat. Janet, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So Roger, wonderful presentation, and the slideshow is amazing. Is there a way that you could share the slideshows?
Yes, I could.
So how would that be done?
If you have a Dropbox account or account that can have it's 78 megabytes in size. So if you have an account that can be mailed to that, I'll mail it to you.
Okay, so I chatted you my email address.
Okay, I'll try to get that.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Laura, you're next.
Okay, I just wanted to talk about the food situation, which is huge, and to talk about, like Roger, number one, I echo the slides you did were fabulous, and the information that you have. One of the things that if people can go visit there, that actually is extremely helpful and useful to see all of those places. But one of the issues that comes up over and over again, and will come up in this country as the climate crisis proceeds, and that is about food. And one of the interesting things is that, as we talked about, I think we've mentioned about Nicaragua, is that what Daniel Ortega, who gets a lot of bad press, even among the left, what he and his administration, what Nicaragua did was to make living in the country more feasible, more enjoyable, even better for the people who were the campesinos who were producing the food, so that Nicaragua has like 80 to 90% food sovereignty, where they produce the food for their own country. And which means that what the government did was they brought roads, schools, healthcare, even parks, assistance, credit, land, reform, all of those things, including the real practical thing about good roads, to the people. And I went to Nicaragua about 1 year and 3 months ago. I think it was March 2021. And I grew up in Western Michigan, and my grandparents had outhouses for toilets, and they didn't have running water in one of the places that they lived. And yet my privilege, I got a jolt when I went to the farm in Nicaragua. It was so rustic. The outhouse was, I had a hard time with it. Just the fact that I'm so used to much more comfort. And yet they had the human connections and things like that, that we lack here and don't even realize that we do. And I want to underscore again that one of the things that the Nicaraguan government did was have parks and entertainment and recognize. I mean, if you want to keep young people someplace, you've got to have them have opportunities for fun and stuff like that. I've mentioned this before, but I grew up in rural, and in order for me to go back to rural, I honestly would have to be sentenced. It would have to be that I committed a crime and they made me go there. I don't want to go back. I want to be in a city. And I know that I'm not the only one that's like that. So that is the reason that I'm saying all this. It has to do with Cuba. And with Venezuela. Venezuela, what happened was that they discovered oil, maybe it's almost a century ago. And everybody thought, okay, let's go. Why do all this hard work in the country? Let's go to the city and let's take advantage of the fact that Venezuela is sitting on so much oil. So they had a huge problem when the sanctions of the US come in with feeding themselves. So much of their food was imported, something like 70% of their food was imported. And then when the imports are terribly hit by the sanctions, that causes a big problem. In Cuba, I was there only once. I wish I'd been there more often. The minute I left, it was in 2015, actually, shortly after Obama did two things, opened up relationships a little bit with Cuba. Sorry, I'm going so long, but
that's okay, Laura, you're okay.
Okay. At the end of 2014, Obama opened up relations, softened the relations with Cuba, and like the next day or within a week, started the sanction process on Venezuela, just to let all of his neoliberal backers know that, oh no, I'm not going soft on imperialism. Right afterward, started calling Venezuela a significant threat to the security of the United States. Oh, it would be laughable if it weren't so tragic. So when I went to Cuba, I went there in early 2015. We had a tour guide. We had like 12 people or something in a van. And it was wonderful. And he said, he was about 40 something, had a couple of kids. And he said that he was a very unusual person. All of his friends are saying, why don't you leave? Highly educated, leading tours. And so many of his friends had left. Why? Because they have individual lives. They have children, they have families. And like Roger pointed out, those remittances that they could send back to Cuba would actually help not just themselves individually, but it would help the people that they had left behind. So all of those things are so huge. You know, the hard life of a farmer, you know, the wanting to have a better life for yourself and your children and your family and your country, and backing the ideas of socialism. And yet for me, wanting to have a better bathroom to go to, you know, it's like all of those things play into the great big huge questions of how do we move toward socialism? And so I actually hope this stuff has made sense. and
thank you, Laura. I would like to add my personal opinion, which I have had discussions with people before. I'm a person who is in favor of industrial agriculture. It should be green, but we need industrial agriculture worldwide. And you can't build socialism behind an animal-drawn plow or a hand plow. That's not going to work. Anyway,
let me just add something to that, Sharon, because when I was in Cuba, I think this was in 2017, we visited one of the organic farms that a lot of the kind of radical tourism goes to. Probably some of you have also been to that farm, and they had very educated, you know, PhD people working there who worked there a long time, and they were very much dedicated to, you know, organic farming and stuff like that. But there was an interesting question that they was asked. There was like, well, you don't use any pesticides and you don't use this, petroleum-based for fertilizer and stuff like that. And what if it was available? And the answer that the main technical guy at the farm said was, he said, look, these are necessities that are imposed upon us. And, but it's not our choice. If we could do a more productive agriculture, we would do it in a heartbeat. So that was interesting because this was a place that was like internationally known for its it's kind of small scale agriculture, but but at least the view of this guy who was the second in charge and a person who was very well educated in agriculture technology, his feeling was, look, that's a necessity, and it's not a virtue.
Right. Right. Okay, I'm going to call on Sharat, followed by Norma, and then maybe Raj and Jean, who have already spoken, can have a second turn. Sharat, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Roger, for this very informative talk, and your perspective on the whole Latin America. First I wanted to comment on a few things and then ask a question. So the comments are mostly about Cuba, because the question earlier was about why is it that Cuba cannot feed itself after all this time. And I don't know, so my experience in Cuba is that the situations where horse-drawn vehicles were used, it goes up and down depending upon the availability of fuel, and Cuba's a foreign exchange situation. So there was a period in the earlier 2000s, I remember, where there was fuel was not a problem because Venezuela was supplying it, and tractors were in use, and there were thousands of tour buses taking tourists around. These buses were from China, and so it depends upon the fuel availability. Right now we have Cuba is in a crisis because Venezuela is unable to supply the crude oil. I mean, for a while, Cuba was able to pay for some of this because Venezuela didn't have the refining capacity. And so Venezuela would send crude oil to Cuba, and Cuba would refine it and send it back to Venezuela. But that's partially broken down because Venezuela has, through the sanctions, been unable to maintain its oil infrastructure, both the production as well as the refining. But the other thing that really we need to take into account of is the extensiveness of the sanctions and how they are enforced. Because even though in the course of the Ukraine war, we've heard relentless talk about, well, every time Russia does something that the West perceives as a human rights violation, then they up the sanctions. And they're always saying, this is what the news is saying, is that the sanctions against Russia are being ramped up to maximum pressure. And yet, when you look at it in global perspective, the extent of the sanctions and also the secondary sanctions that are applied on countries or entities that buy or sell with sanctioned entities is nowhere close when you compare Russia against the sanctions that have been in place for many years against Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and North Korea. And the evidence for this is that periodically you hear about sanctions, U.S. making sanctions fines against companies for violating sanctions, particularly against Iran and Venezuela. We haven't heard too much, in the case of Cuba, because those sanctions have been long established. They've been there for decades. So that's what makes it so difficult for Cuba to get the inputs that it needs, and also to sell what it has. But the other thing, of course, is just the way that world capitalist markets devalue the currencies of socialist countries. So whereas the nominal value of a Cuban peso should be close to parity with the dollar, it has been devalued 24 times, 25 times. So this is why you have everything seems so cheap to us if we go and travel in Cuba and pay in dollars. Everything is incredibly cheap if you're buying things that are for locals. But that conversely means that it's incredibly expensive for Cuba to buy anything from abroad. So that and no country in Latin America, even the United States, no country in the Western Hemisphere is self-sufficient in food. Everyone has to import something, and Cuba has this crisis. Okay, my question is on a slightly different topic, and that is that on the left, there's and you've given an excellent talk, about how the left is coming up again in Latin America. But I wanted to try to address some of the, and I don't understand them, but I've heard a lot of other leftists criticize the situation, for example, in Nicaragua and Daniel Ortega, and so my understanding of those critiques are that there are some anti-democratic processes there, and I'm wondering whether you can elaborate on them, and because nothing is perfect. I think we should admit that democratic functioning and elements of socialism in Latin America as anywhere else, nothing is perfect, and we should be able to say what's good and also critique what isn't working so well. So can you elaborate on what's happening in Venezuela in that regard?
Venezuela or Nicaragua?
I'm sorry, Nicaragua. Sorry.
Okay.
Nicaragua.
And I should say that I had the privilege of being with Sharat in April when we were both observing the elections in Ecuador, which we didn't really get into very much. It's a complex situation there. I would go a little bit further than your question, because you say, we should be able to criticize. And I would really ask a deeper question, Sharat, of what is the purpose of the criticism? What do we want to achieve it? Is it some sort of intellectual quest for pristine truth? Or is there some other political purpose? And if there's another political purpose, then what is the political purpose in questioning this? And so it's not, so I don't take the position that I have to be a nanny for all the left groups in organizations in Latin America. I say, what is the purpose of criticism? And so let's go back to Bolivia, where the Evo Morales government was criticized by a lot of leftists for being authoritarian. And there was a whole litany of things that they had wrong with Evo's government. And then there was a coup. And the justification of the coup came from those leftists who made criticisms previously of Evo. So we're saying, okay, you made criticisms and maybe they're valid criticisms, but were they justified in the result, which was a coup, and a coup that became legitimized by the criticisms from the left. So I'm not saying where you have to stand, but I think you have to ask your question of what is the purpose of criticism. In Nicaragua particularly, there's been a history. There's a history of the United States opposing democracy. It's not just in Nicaragua, it is the history of the United States. It is the founding basis of the United States. The United States was founded by Christian fascists. They were called pilgrims, but they're Christian fascists. It has never been a bastion of democracy and free thought. And then in Nicaragua, the United States, the Marines, I don't have the exact dates there, but for about 30 years, occupied Nicaragua. They only left Nicaragua when the Somoza dictatorship was installed to do the work that the Marines had previously done. When the Somoza dictatorship was overthrown by the Sandinistas, the United States funded and instigated and fomented the Contras. So the United States' role in Nicaragua has never been one of supporting democracy. In fact, it's been the role of suppressing and making democracy impossible under the dictatorships that it previously had, or the military occupation. So we do have this history that we have to put it into context. Now, I'm not, the area that I know the most about and I'm most involved in is in Nicaragua. Excuse me, in Venezuela. So I did visit Nicaragua last November, and I met with a number of people, some of them you probably know as well. And I really asked them the same question you asked me, Sharad. I said, look, there's a lot of criticism. You know, we basically support Nicaragua, but are there any hidden skeletons in the closet? What's what's the real skinny? Because I want to know the real truth. The people who I really respected felt that basically that Nicaragua was doing the right thing under very, very, very difficult things. There was issues about the morality of Daniel Ortega and whether or not he had sexual relations with his wife's daughter and stuff like that. Something that the accusations that have been made that we don't really know the answers to. But even if we did know the answers to, we would probably still end up saying that on balance, we support the Nicaraguan revolution. And I think that really is where I would come from, that the Nicaraguan revolution is one that has been very successful, is really met people's needs. I'm gonna, just by coincidence, I'm leaving for Nicaragua on the 16th of this month for their 43rd celebration of their revolution. Most of those criticisms I've gone through pretty closely. I can give you the rebuttals to them, but basically it's the larger question of the imperialists are trying to overthrow any alternative to the imperialist hegemony. And maybe we could take this on offline, but because I don't want to, it's a good question, and I realize I haven't answered it in its entirety.
Okay, Norma, you're next.
Hi, everybody. Everybody should know that you can all put your picture up if you want to. You can take your cancellation sign out of your what's shown and show your picture, show that you're a participant here, and we like to look at you. The thing that got me to, first of all, I've posted a lot of brilliant commentary in the chat. I hope you got a chance to take a look at it. I want you to know that we need to come to where all work is essential. All work equals all work. Now, this can't happen in a capitalist society where we are so divided, we are so separated. So trying to imagine it, trying to envision how that works, take the researching scientist and ask him to get rid of garbage off the streets in a united, in a structural manner. Or, the Cultural Revolution was designed to do that kind of thing in China. And it just drove people crazy, the privilege that went from, I'm a violinist and I have to empty garbage or whatever. And now years later, people in China are appreciating the intent and the possibility of the choice of the work that people do, so that everyone can participate at all levels and not have a privileged status in society because of their degrees and diplomas from vaunted institutions, that they just become participant in society and do the things that we need and want to do. And so that when you're unloading garbage and that you don't do it all your life, and you don't do it 8 hours a day. There is no such thing as an 8-hour-a-day job per se. There is work to do, and you choose to do it, and you can spend as much time as you want to do it, and you have obligations to your community because you feel as though it's your community, and people live together and not separated. This idea of lonely existences, because we're all contrived now, especially through school, to compete against each other. That's the device. I'm going to post a note in the chat and ask you to refer me to people, or refer people to me who will sign my petitions. I'm going to campaign again for the school board in Berkeley. I'm going to tell you details, and you can copy them down and use them to help me get my petition signed before July 28th, to let me get on the ballot, where I will not be promoting the status quo. I will not be trying to fix one of our major owners' institutions, the public, what they call a public school. Somebody called it compulsory public education, as though
Okay, Norma, we need to move on to.
No.
discussion.
You can let me finish what I'm saying too. You've let other people go on, and I have a couple of other things to add to this. The idea that, it'd be good to industrialize whatever needs to be mechanized. That's been done constantly, but not to the degree of roboticizing, putting mechanical objects into whatever field it is. We're already robots. We already go and serve in a roboticized manner. And that's one of the things people have difficulty recognizing. So we want to help people realize that. And you did read my comment about the relationship of Russia to this whole event, I hope.
Okay, thank you. Raj, Jean, and then Laura. And I think that will probably bring us to the time to stop. But if anyone else wants to speak, please raise your hand. Go ahead, Raj.
I will yield to Laura if she has things to answer some of the questions before.
Okay, Laura, Raj is yielding to you.
So one of the things I wanted to do was just give a shout out to Hugo Chavez and to regional integration, because although he died in 2013, it's almost 10 years ago, what he did, and he got some criticism within Venezuela by saying, why don't you just focus on Venezuela? But he read history voraciously, and he knew that if you stand alone, you don't have a chance against the empire. And so he, one of the things that they did was that both Bush II and Obama went to South America for a free trade agreement of the Americas, and we all know what free trade does to people. And Hugo took a shovel to the summit of whatever the gathering was called, but he said, "We come to bury you to the free trade of the Americas, agreement of the Americas." And what Roger described, it was so beautifully presented about how the pink tide came and went. So much of that has to do with the regional integration. And there's always a lot of things that we can learn. We in California, we in whatever state you're in, we in the United States, and that has to do with collaboration. It has to do with integration. It has to not be the only correct, right person in the room, but that other people have, in that case, it was other countries. Hugo Chavez modeled not even just going along with his buddies. He kept going to the president, whoever the president was of Colombia, which was arch enemy in terms of being aligned with multiple military bases of the US and all that. He would go and talk to the presidents. He would create these regional integration having to do with trade, with commerce, with health, with oil, with giving people new retinas so they could see, all of those things. So I just wanted to give a shout out to the concept of collaborating with people, even if you don't agree completely.
Thank you, Laura. I think you really hit on a very important thing, that in the issue of regional integration and the way Venezuela led that struggle and continues to be instrumental in that struggle. I think of all the things that the Bolivarian Revolution did, the one that threatened the empire the most, the one that caused the empire to really target it, and to recognize actually that Venezuela was the leader and therefore had to be decapitated or tried to, was the fact that it was for regional integration, because that is the only way, or the only way right now, to provide the room for people to reach their sovereignty, their independence, and to have breathing room from the capitalist order, is to form regional alliances. I think right now I'm kind of diverging, and that's sort of out of my wheelhouse as well. But I think that the fact that the Europe at one point was becoming more independent from the United States, and that the big event right now is the fact that the European Union has now once again become completely subservient to the United States. And that is a tremendous setback for the struggle to end US hegemony, because it strengthens US hegemony. I mean, now Germany is, instead of building up its own economy, it's supporting US weapons manufacturers. But I'm getting off on a whole new subject. So let me apologize for that and turn it back to Sharon.
Okay. Yeah, let me add that sadly, Muammar Gaddafi was murdered by the United States. He was trying to play the same role in Africa. And of course, that's what's needed, is a regional integration in Africa as well. Raj and then Jean.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I think it's a very good discussion, and
Raj, your voice is quite low.
Oh, okay. So I'll try to speak louder.
Yeah, thank you.
So one of the things that I think, Roger, you recognized is that the U.S. imperialism's power is somewhat waning, because these alternate BRICS you mentioned has arisen, to which other two countries have applied and probably will get membership, Iran and Argentina. So actually the GDP also, in terms of purchasing power parity now, is actually higher than the other blocks. But in hard dollars, it's so I think there's a new word emerging despite United States trying to stay as the top hegemon, and it still remain top hegemon for a while. So that dynamics is taking place now, and I think, again, off the subject, Ukraine war is a kind of tied to that. So in Latin America, the solidarity movement is important, integration is important. But after all, socialism is overthrow of capitalism. And that's where compromises remain both to survive at the same time to undermine it. This is the problem we're facing. And as far as the question of labor in Cuba not wanting to do, I understand they have educated their people, which is what a socialist country will do. But the point is that the labor, in terms of motivation, etc., liberalism is not Lenin and Stalin's. It's not practical when you build socialism. So Lenin was very much against any kind of liberalism. Is there liberalism seeping into Cuba? Is that thing? And Sharat's comment about democracy is the democracy is in a socialist type is very different, and you've gone there, Sharat. You've seen how elections have taken place and made a very excellent presentation. But democracy and socialism democracy and socialism is different. So both of you would care to comment on this, what I've just said. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but I'll answer it by asking a question rather than answering. And that is to say, revolution is still on the agenda, but we also have to understand that in the last half century, we have not seen a successful socialist revolution. And there needs to be analysis why that hasn't been. It's not for the fact that it didn't occur to people that they should be a socialist revolution. But the last socialist revolution was 1959 with Cuba. That's a long time ago. So that's part of that answer. The other part of the answer, well, I'll mention two other things. Another thing is that because of U.S. hegemony, all the revolutions have had to compromise. All the socialist countries have had to compromise. Cuba has instituted a number of measures that we would call in the direction of, not in the direction of socialism, but in the direction of capitalism. They've done that to survive. And then the final point that I would say is that we mentioned a lot about, so far in this discussion, about how painful the blockade is, the US blockade. Another aspect of it is that it is corrosive, and it's corrosive on social values, and particularly on socialist social values. When you have the situation of extreme scarcity, the whole idea of community, of sharing, of communality, that gets corroded. And when you have 60 years of living under a situation where every day is a struggle to make ends meet, that is very corrosive. So to answer your question is, yes, there is liberalism, there is individualism, and it is precisely the blockade that is kind of the fertilizer for that type of activity.
Okay, Jean.
Yeah, well, again, thank you so much. And I really appreciate this whole discussion, which I think is the, is a crucial part of the pathway to peace. But I did want to talk a little bit, or you mentioned, the struggle and the peace movement in the United States is so dismal, or what passes for a peace movement. And the recent vote over the Ukraine, for example, the entire, not only the squad, but the entire Black Congressional Caucus all voted to support sending money to Ukraine, which is very dismal. And the only people that voted against it were Republicans. I think like 50 in the House and Rand Paul, of all people, in the Senate. So that's a dismal situation, but they were the ones that voted the right way on that. No Democrats did. But on the other hand, I think, it's not saying we should ally with any Republicans, but as we know, when the next vote comes on about money to attack China, they're going to be, 150% in favor of that. So again, we do have some fair weather friends. We do need to be cautious about our own alliances and so forth. But the key thing, and I'll just say a little thing about my own organization, Vets for Peace, the hat that I'm wearing today. Vets for Peace has always supported Nicaragua, our president, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and the revolutionary movements there. And you remember when there was the occupation of the Venezuelan embassy, where our State Department said, well, the Guaido people should occupy it. And as I recall, the Maduro people stayed in. So there's a big blockade and people were fighting there. And our president, Jerry Condon, was arrested. I don't think he was arrested. He was beaten up by the cops for throwing a cucumber up to the second floor to feed the people inside, which is kind of weird commentary. But I just wanted to make that comment and urge people to join the peace organization of their choice. So thank you.
Thank you, and welcome back, Jerry Condon, to the United States.
He's quite a guy.
He's on this call right now.
He is here on the call.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry.
So we're going to end the recording in just a minute. Roger, would you like to have any last words?
Yes, please. Thank you very much. So kind of in response to what Jean said, I wanted to quote something that about the present situation, particularly when you talked about the majority of the United States legislature voting for an astronomical amount of money, enough money that we could have ended homelessness and ended hunger in this country. Yet we didn't have the means to do that, but we have the means to fuel the military. And what person I want to quote is a guy named Alfred Marder, M-A-R-D-E-R. Al Marder is the head of the U.S. Peace Council. And what he said was, what we saw in that vote was 75 years, the fruits of 75 years of anti-communism coming home to roost. I thought that was kind of a profound statement. I think it probably will resonate with many people here at the Marxist Library. And just in closing then, I want to just thank the library for hosting this event. As you know, the numbers of venues where you can put forward these type of ideas are becoming fewer and fewer around. And so I'm very grateful that to be part of a decades-long tradition. And thank you very much for joining us tonight, or this morning rather.
Thank you. Raj, could you please stop the recording?
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.